Welcome back to Giant Monster Games. Today, we are going to take a look at how you build a mana base for your deck. The mistake I most commonly see, and the reason I'm making this video, is I see people building a 60 card deck and they've been told you put in 20 lands and the rest are spells and creatures. So they take 20 lands and they put it into their deck. If they're playing 2 colors, they literally take 10 of each type of land, put them into their deck, and voila, they've finished. Let me tell you, that's not how you build a mana base for your deck. Let's talk about the things you need to consider before you just start putting in 10 of each color. The first thing we should consider is, what is your turn 1 plan? Magic, no matter how you look at it, is an aggressive game. You need to know what your turn 1 game plan is because it's going to affect your mana base. So what do I actually mean by this? Let's consider that you are playing a Jund deck, so you're playing green, black, red. And on turn 1, you either want to play Thoughtseize or Inquisition of Kozilect. That means you need black mana in your opening hand. So we need to figure out how many black mana sources we need to almost guarantee or give ourselves a really good chance of having that black mana in our opening hand. The next thing we need to consider is, what cards do we have in our deck that are part of our win condition, and what turn do we need to be able to play those cards by? Keeping with our Jund theme, let's assume that we are also playing Kalidas. He is a main win condition for our deck, so we need to make sure that we can play him by turn 4. So the question is, how many black mana sources do we need to have in our deck to ensure that we'll be able to play him by turn 4? I'll answer that question in a bit once we know all the factors to our deck. The next factor is, what is the color distribution in our deck? So this can look a ton of different ways, and I'm not going to obviously go through every single possibility, but I'll cover the most common ones. So you could have a monocolor deck where it only has 1 color in it, a balanced deck where the distribution of 2 colors is about the same, a primary with secondaries where you have maybe 50% of one color and then 25 and 25 of the other 2, and lastly a splash color, which is kind of like the other ones except you have an addition of a color that maybe only makes up maybe 5 or 10% of your deck. The most common place you'd see this is in like a limited deck where you're drafting and you say, hey, I want to get that black removal or I want to get that green ramp in there. So you've kind of taken a couple cards that are really not part of the colors you're already drafting, but you're going to add them into your deck to get that extra bonus. So these are the primary factors you need to consider when building your mana base. Now that we kind of have them all laid on the table, let's go back to our Jund deck and we'll take a look at what we really need to play. We have 30 mana symbols that are black, 10 mana symbols that are green, and 9 mana symbols that are red. So we're looking at a 50, 25, 25. If we were going to build our mana base incorrectly, we would add in 10 swamps, 5 forests, and 5 mountains. Well, no, that's not how this is going to work. So what is our turn 1 game plan? I mentioned it earlier, we want to play either Thoughtseize or Inquisition of Kozilect, meaning we need black mana on turn 1 to do that. So are 10 swamps enough to guarantee that we're going to have black mana on turn 1? Let's do some math and find out. So our calculation is going to look something like this. Number of cards that produce a specific type of mana, divided by the deck size, multiplied by the number of cards drawn. Generally for our opening hand, it's going to be 7 cards. So in this case, it's 10 divided by 60 times 7, which gives us 1.17, meaning we should, in theory, draw one in our opening hand, and we have a 17% chance of having a second one. So this is actually pretty low, because what happens if we mulligan down to 6, or mulligan down to 5? The answer is, if we mulligan down to 6, we have a probability of having 1 swamp, but if we mulligan down to 5, we're sitting at 83% of drawing a swamp. So the question becomes, how many swamps do we need to ensure that we're going to have a swamp if we mulligan down to 5 in the absolute worst case scenario? The answer to that is 13. If we do our math, it's 13 divided by 60 times 5, because that's how many cards we're getting, and we're sitting now at 1.08. So we should, in theory, draw a swamp even if we mulligan down to 5. I keep saying swamps, but in reality I mean black sources of mana. I'm saying swamps because it's a little bit easier to understand for basic lands. Now let's figure out how many black sources of mana we need to cast Kalidas on turn 4. Now assuming we don't have any mana ramp in this deck, we know that we're not going to be playing this card until turn 4 because we're playing 1 land a turn. This also means if we're on the play, we're going to have 3 additional draws. So let's do the math on 13 swamps to see if we will actually have 2 black mana symbols by turn 4. So 13 divided by 60 times 10, because that's the most amount of cards we're going to be drawing, assuming we keep a 7 card opening hand, equals 2.16. So that's not terrible. I mean, that means we're guaranteed to have 2 and we have a 16% chance for a third. But 13 divided by 60 times 8, which is if we mulligan down to 5, we're sitting at 1.73, which means we probably won't have a second black mana symbol for turn 4. And this is where the learning curve on how you build a mana base comes into play. The question needs to be, if you don't have that black mana for turn 4, will your deck completely fall apart? Do you absolutely need to play this by turn 4? That's something I obviously can't answer in this video for every single deck, but it's something you need to ask yourself when you're actually looking at your deck and what your plan is as you're playing it. If you're playing a combo deck and you need that mana to combo off, then the answer might be yeah, you definitely do need it. So maybe you need to put more lands in so you can guarantee that draw. Or like most combo decks, you can put an extra card draw or mana ramp to solve that problem. Getting back to our Jund deck, let's talk about green and red, because we also need those types of mana as well. Ideally, we want the option to be able to play one or the other on turn 2. So how many of each type of mana symbol do we need to guarantee that on turn 2, we can play either or? If we're keeping a full hand of 7, the answer is 8. If not, and we're going to be mulliganing down to 5 cards, we need 10. So in conclusion, what I'm telling you is you need to run 35 basic lands to fulfill all these requirements. And this is where lands that produce more than one type of mana come into play. That's how you bring this number all the way down from 35 down to the 23-24 range. In this case, we can play some of the pain lands, such as Blood Crypt, Overgrown Tomb, and Stomping Grounds. These, as you can guess, work extremely well with your fetch lands, such as your Bloodstained Mire or Wooded Foothills. As you can see, Bloodstained Mire can fetch a swamp or a mountain, and Blood Crypt is both a swamp and a mountain. Another good option is using the fast lands, such as Blackcleave Cliffs, which enter the battlefield untapped if you have 2 or fewer lands, which is when it matters the most specifically in this deck. So as you can see, by adding a few of these cards in, we can take this number from 35 all the way down to 24. And as you can see, I've left in some basic lands because cards like Ghost Quarters and Path of Exile allow you to get a basic land, and not having any in your deck when that card is played kinda sucks for you. So that's the meat and potatoes on how you build a mana base. But let me quickly touch on splash colors and on monocolor decks right before I go. When it comes to splash colors, my recommendation is this. You need to ask yourself, do you absolutely need this card in your deck? If the answer is yes, then you need to ask, when do you want to play it by? If you're playing a limited format such as Sealed or Draft, this is why they run 17 lands in a 40-card deck. You want to be able to draw all your colors as fast as possible. If you're running 5 sources of mana in a 40-card deck, you should draw that card with your 8th draw, so technically on turn 2. In regards to monocolor decks, if you want to be playing your 3rd land consistently, then you need to be running a minimum of 20 lands. But if you are running some mana acceleration, then you can totally lower the number of lands you're playing. On the opposite side, if you're playing higher cost creatures, such as 4 drops and 5 drops, you may actually need more lands than 20, just because you need to be able to draw into them sooner rather than later. An example, running 22 lands in a 60-card deck, keeping an opening hand of 7 cards, means you should have 4 lands in your hand by the time you draw your 11th card. So in conclusion, think about what cards you want to be playing, when you want to be playing them, and what's your actual game plan. When do you need certain types of mana? How much mana do you need by a certain turn? Put it into this formula and figure it out. This is how I build all of my decks, and I hope you guys can take this and apply it to your decks to make some strong mana-based decks. That's it. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing, and don't forget to game like a giant monster.